are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Podcast, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Ed Liebig. Ed, thanks very much for joining me. This is kind of the second take because we tried to do this, I think, last week, and we had some technical difficulties. How are you?
No, I'm very good. Thank you, David. Thanks for having me on today.
It's funny. The reason why it didn't work the last time, it seems like, IT systems are complex. We take a lot of things for granted. Even doing this was not possible up to several years ago. And you specifically have mastered the cybersecurity domain. Why don't you get started with kind of give me the quick background and how you got into the space, what were your kind of the first couple of roles, and how you progressed and become more and more proficient in the cybersecurity space.
Well, sure. Thanks, David. So I started in IT as a fluke, actually. I was in the summer break between junior and senior year in high school, and I took a job as a lawn boy to cut the grass for a savings and loan. And serendipitously, the electricians went on strike the day I showed up. And they were in a panic mode because they didn't have anybody to pull cable for their new data center they were putting in. That was my foray into data processing. So I loved that summer.
Hold on for a second, Ed. Let me double click on that one. That's an incredible story. I always tell people that want to get into space, just grab something. You just never know who you're going to meet. Don't sit at home. Grab anything. You're going to end up doing something, and it's just incredible that something like that basically triggered, your entire career. So you were actually laying cables in the data center for that moment?
Yeah. So this was back in the mainframe days. It was a Burroughs 8000 that they were putting into a savings and loan proprietary local savings and loan, about 7 or 8 branches. And the electricians didn't show up, and they said, "Well, does anybody know anything about computers?" And I raised my hand. I said, "Sure, I know about them," because I had worked on the teletype terminal in grade school. Just having the confidence. So I went in, and at that time, the cables they were using were RS-232, so the 32-pin connectors. So you had to actually terminate those by hand and then snap them all together. So that was a good job for me. I terminated the cables and ran them around. And in the data center, I learned, what connected to what and what were the different components of the mainframe, which just intrigued the heck out of me. So I really focused the rest of my high school and college on data processing. At the time, that was before PCs were invented and widely used. To get into the mainframe community, you had to be a relative of or know somebody in IBM. Or Burroughs. You had to know somebody in the industry to even break into computer science, unless you were going to be a COBOL programmer or something like that. Programming never interested me at early ages, so I really went the networking route. But that landed me in the Navy about 10 years later, and being in the Navy and forward deploying out to theater operations to set up data centers. That showed me that it was truly a life or death situation if what I was processing in those machines ever got to the adversaries. And that's where I really shifted my focus on security and how do we secure that data in the field. And at the time, there's a tongue-in-cheek reference on my bookshelf up here. Those are all orange binders for a reason. It used to be called the Orange Book, and that was the top secret data classification process for data processing in the Navy, the Orange Book, the Rainbow series, but the orange was for top secret. And I was tasked to take an Orange Book out into the field with me and take notes and see how well that worked in a mobile compute situation. Because we had the emergence of luggable computing was starting to come around, and they were thinking about making smaller footprints and making it more deployable, since it had worked out so famously during Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So that being said, I took the Orange Book out and I was taking notes. And I said, well, this is too rigid. This doesn't work in the field. This is all for a a data center, a secured data center. Lots of reliance on physical security, lots of reliance on things that don't exist in the field. So my report back to the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet was, this isn't working. We need to come up with something different. And that's where the frameworks started to come into play. So you ask how I got into security. That was the start. How did I grow in security was I lived the iterations of security. Early days of security, the head of security was a router jockey or a firewall guy that could, segment the network and knew the ins and outs of communications. And that was really about it. When I got out of the Navy and I told people I did information security, they'd say, "Oh, you're a systems admin. You create user IDs." About that much of it. That's just a very smidgen of it. It's a broader field than that. And I've had the opportunity and the pleasure of watching the craft of security grow and now become recognized in corporate America outside of just military operations.
And then you glance over the fact that in the Navy, I'm sure you've, what people don't realize, I talked to a lot of veterans as well, is the intensity of the training and the amount of things that you're responsible for a very short time. You can be as young as, in your early 20s and you're dealing with things in matters of national security at a scale that is nothing compared to in the civilian life. And also the training itself is, when you do 6 months training in the Navy, it's not 6 months training at, 9 to 5 and you go and you college, whatever, you go home and you go out partying. It's some of them almost like 24/7 when you only sleep like 6 hours a day and the rest you are actually trained. And it provides you that discipline as well, right? So you learn that you have to go through and it's very structured. So talk to me about what are kind of the key elements that you took away from the Navy that allows you to then apply, outside? And what was the transition like from the Navy to the civilian life in terms of, getting the next role and the next role?
So one of the things that I learned in the Navy is that there's no I in team. That was very apparent to me. You can't be self-centered and say, I'm going to save the world. You have to really adopt the we're going to save the world and live by that and let your team shine and perform. I'm a big advocate of allowing my personnel to interject ideas and run with them. And I think that's something that corporate America is starting to come around to with the whole inclusion movement and the thing where everybody has a voice and the diversity thing, the diverse opinions are there, are valuable. I think I learned that lesson, 25 years ago because of the Navy, because I would let my team voice opinions and voice ideas and then give them the slack to go and act on those and make programs that made sense for the mission. As long as it's moving the ball towards the mission, then you need to let your people really innovate because the best innovation, I think, comes from the doers and not the thinkers. Thinkers get the ideas and the direction, but the doers get the way to get there. And I think that's what you really need to recognize. Recognition of people's strengths comes into play there. I do believe that in the military, you do have such a rapid, in the Navy especially, your rotation is every 3 years. So you're going to turn over your entire staff every 3 years. So they spend a year coming up to speed, they spend a year doing, and then they spend a year winding down and teaching others. And that's how you have to plan. Well, I think that corporate America needs to understand that as well. Instead of putting a job description out for a purple unicorn that for an entry-level position needs 2 years experience, no. You need to craft your roles so that you can get an entry-level employee with an EQ and an IQ enough to do the job that you can mold them. And you need to mold them in a fashion that they believe that you believe in them. I heard an analogy where this barista was working at the Four Seasons Hotel, and when asked, do you like your job? He said, "No, I love my job." And then when you say, "Well, why do you love your job?" It's because all of the management, any manager, not just my manager, any manager walking by goes, "Do you need anything to do your job better? Can I help you excel? Do you have any ideas of making this better?" That type of interaction, that type of freedom, I think, is what is going to keep an employee. So by training an entry-level person to actually become a security professional is very valuable. But if you want to keep them, you have to make their worth more than just the training, more than just the paycheck. You have to make sure that they're satisfied emotionally and have an emotional connection to the company and to their coworkers.
It's so interesting that you mentioned the Four Seasons. I think that I have like firsthand experience with dealing with some of the executives there years ago, and the whole mission is to make sure that the customer is happy, and there's very little, define what that is. Even the barista or somebody at the front desk has the freedom to go ahead and do what's right for the customer. And there's a story there, and I'll share that with you, where somebody who rented a very high-end suite found a cookie remains in one of the drawers, and the staff called the helpline and said, "Okay, can you fix this?" And they did, but they also they cleaned the room, and also when they came back, the staff went out and bought cookie baskets and put it all around the room, and so. And it's completely on their own. It was not in the manual for them to do that. But, what do you think that the person remembered? Remember the fact that not that they found cookie crumbs in their drawers, the fact that the staff went out of the way and made him feel welcome, and it's also when stuff happens, that's, is the moment to shine as well, so I think that's, it's true also for cyber, right? So the moment you get seen is when stuff happened and you dealt with it correctly. Because when things are status quo and nothing happens, you're almost anonymous, right? Nobody recognizes you. Hey, so you feel that, you fulfill some very interesting roles as the Chief Information Security Officer in some very large organizations as well. So what was kind of the turning point from, again, from the Navy, fulfilling some of the first roles and then advancing yourself to such a prominent figure in the space? What was the kind of the steps you took?
So the way I approached my career path was I wanted to learn more than just the piece I was working on. And so I always focused myself on the larger picture and how I fit into the wheel, how my cog was part of the whole wheel. And so if I was assigned to, so first off, I should say that I spent time when I first got out of the military as MIS, which at the time there was no role of CIO, but for a law firm, I was the manager of their information systems. And my real task was pick a new operating system, pick a new topology for them to operate their law firm under. So I had the opportunity to have developers and network teams and things at my disposal. This is small organization. In my my experiences went to much larger organizations, but this was about 100 or 120 attorneys, support staff, and whatnot. So it wasn't that huge of a operation. So I had the opportunity to really get more well-rounded, away from the military environment in commercial type compute processing, IT processing.
And Ed, let me double click on that one for a second, because when you were doing that, there was not a lot of manuals and how-tos available back then, right?
Right. Yeah. No.
People now have like the luxury of having all the stuff written up, like they have all the frameworks, all the stuff, all the YouTube videos and so on. But you at a time, so what was your approach to figure things out?
Yeah, there was a lot of skinned knees. I did, fall down and pick myself back up, made decisions that weren't quite as wise as I thought they were at the time. A good example of that was there was this small manufacturer in St. Louis that was making desktops from scratch. They would buy the components, they'd snap them together, and they'd sell them. It was the motherboard technology had just come out, so they just basically snapped the components together and sold them. And they were competing with one of the bigger firms at the time, Gateway. Gateway had just emerged, and they were a mail house order for these devices. The leadership wanted to do this transition, but save a lot of money because the resources they had purchased were very, very expensive. Each desktop was north of $2,000, and I could get these components from St. Louis much cheaper. I could get 4 or 5 desktops for the price of one. But what I found was that they didn't have any quality control. And I found out this the hard way. They didn't have any quality control on which components they were putting in each of the machines. So now I had all these cheap components, but when an update came, 10% of them would crash, and I wouldn't know why. It's because they had a different sound driver, they had a different, video card, or something silly was different in these devices. So it was unmanageable. So I learned that the hard way. And then ITIL and some of these standards start coming out. And of course, I adopted my style to embrace those over my career. But at the time, I skinned my knees a couple of times on some bad decisions. But you don't let it get you down. You learn from it. And you say, okay, well, that wasn't a good decision. Let's reuse those. Or let's recycle and reuse those in a different capacity, and we'll get something with more quality control. And you learn from your mistakes and you adjust. So I think that's really what I've had. Again, I said at the beginning, I had the luxury of watching this grow up. I've had the luxury of watching these standards and these frameworks come into play. Years ago when the CMMI had just been released from Carnegie Mellon, I had the opportunity in the Navy to field test the CMMI process for Carnegie Mellon to see if the maturity modeling worked to help standardize some of the things we were doing. And I really liked it. But so when it was released to the public, I'm like, hey, that's a great idea. So let's look at the British standard, the BS 17799 standard, and let's apply that now to the CMMI measurement and see what we can do. Well, that's now what you do, right? Now you do that against 27001, against Nist, against all these things. You use the CMMI as your measurement tool, your yardstick. But that's what I mean by I've had the opportunity to watch this stuff grow and become second nature almost in cybersecurity. The shift that I've found very interesting is the shift to operational technology. So that's been really my focus since early 2000s. Right after 9/11, I was involved in Digital Pearl Harbor 2002 in Newport, Rhode Island, and that was a think tank exercise. We had 95 or 100 or so people gathered from 4 different industry verticals, and the objective was ruin your industry by a cyber attack, and tell us the timing, tell us the timeline of how that happens, and when is going to be the day you'll actually pull the rug out from under your industry. So we all went off in our own little think tanks, and then they coordinated those efforts to happen on a single day. So all 4 industries would collapse on the same day. It was downplayed in the news. It was downplayed in the results. They said, oh, well, it was all theoretical. It really couldn't happen. Everybody who attended went, oh, holy smokes, this is real. We really can do this. We could cripple the United States by doing this. So that really can't be. That's where I kind of pivoted on my foot to look at critical infrastructure. It wasn't even called that back then. It was just looking at the things that really make us go. I was in financial services at the time, working for a very large insurance carrier. But my focus was on financial, oil and gas, power, energy sector in general, and things that really would affect our lives. Because as everybody knows now, you disrupt the power supply in 3 to 5 days, we're out of food. We have no fuel. We can't get it up out of the ground because the electric grid's down. And it ensues.
Let me double click on that because I don't think people realize that. I think people, you're 100% correct. Even if we have the physical resources, like if we have natural gas, we can't pipe it, right? If
right.
You know, you can't take it out of the ground because you don't have the power. There's some mechanism behind the scenes that funnels all those resources, and we don't have, what's the backup generation? Like we have that for what, 2-3 days. I mean, there's the diesel fuel only lasts so long for some of these systems, right?
Right. That's absolutely true. So in that insurance carrier, that was actually a funny story. I was looking at the business continuity plans of the main office in Canada, and I showed up and I was taking a tour of the backup systems, and there were generators on the roof, these huge generators on the roof, and I said, "That's terrific. What happens when the fuel runs dry?" And they said, "Oh, we've got a contract with the carrier, and they'll come out every 2 days and refill the fuel." And I said, "That's beautiful. That's a great answer. Appreciate that. Let me see those contracts, and I'll get back to you." So I looked over the contracts, and it said, yeah, they come out every 2 days, and they'd fill the generator with gasoline, and they would always be full. And I called my guy back, and I said, those are diesel generators, right? Your contract says gasoline. So you've got to be very aware of your plans to actually stay in front of a threat. There's 2 ways. You can either eliminate the threat, or you can make the threat hurt less.
The devil's in the details.
Yeah, and
right?
It is in the details. That's right.
But you were meticulous about like actually reading the contract, like how many people actually go through, and there's a lot of things now with the cyber insurance. We can talk about that as well. Like what happens now. There's a lot of clause that exempt, the insurance company from paying out the payee. Right. So what was the end result of that they had to switch to rewrite the contract?
We had the contract fixed pretty quickly, but yeah, it was kind of one of those things that I'm really glad it didn't come down to us meeting those deliveries, because we would have, one, either ruined our generators because nobody would have checked what they were pumping into it, or 2, we would have really blown something up. So that wouldn't have been good.
Well, do you have any other stories? I love these stories because, again, these are not typically things that you hear about. A lot of times, depending on who you talk to, it's one of 2 things. Either like the sky's falling, and things are really bad, or it's like the Lego movie and everything's great. I mean, there's not much so much in between. In your career, what other stories can you tell us about specifically about the things that you come across? And you talked a bit about the standards and how you saw them evolve. Any other insights you can provide from adoption and things that you've seen throughout your career?
Well, sure. So one of the things that I had the opportunity to do was work with a large chemical manufacturer, and I was able to actually travel the globe to all of their global sites and really look at in depth in their operational technology stack to look for what is their exposed risk from a cyber attack perspective. And by doing that, in conjunction with this chemical company, we devised what we had coined the consequence-based risk assessment. So it's a risk assessment that says the probability is 1. It's going to happen. So let's just get probability off the table. Now, when it happens, what's your risk? What's going to happen? What's the effect on the organization? What's the effect on production? What's the effect on life, health, safety? What are we defined 5 to 7 categories depending on the volatility or the hazardousness level, the hazard level of the operations. And then we would measure against those 5 to 7 criterion to say life, health, safety is really the highest risk. Next risk would be loss of production. Next risk would be loss of public confidence. All of those categories then would be assessed based on what happened. And then you would look at your safeguards and your mitigating safeguards to say, how can we lower that risk? How can we actually make that hurt less? How can we actually recover the systems faster to make the monetary loss less? Public confidence, how can we get in front of the story and have have confidence maintained throughout the events. That process actually made the first iteration of the ISO 99 standard, which is now the ISA IEC 62443 standard. So that was, to me, a very exciting time in molding something that was going to be used moving forward. Eric Kostman, I worked very closely with him on the ISO 99 project to really give field interaction from the field on how well this worked. That's a very proud moment for me to be able to actually work on something like that. So I think that's really now going to be the focus going forward. OT is really our next frontier. It's the next battleground, or current battleground, actually.
Yeah, and we are definitely in the battle. And how do you quantify? So the problem is we have almost unlimited risk, right? So operational risk or otherwise, and we have limited funds. So how do you and you're big onto measuring, right? So how do you quantify, specifically the risk? And like, look at the pandemic, right? Everyone did not see that coming. We had to work remote within 2 weeks, this entire industries. But it wasn't a kind of, pandemic. I wouldn't say it was in the top 20 or top 30. How do you quantify? And then the outcome of quantification, I guess, is to define where you're going to make the investment and how to, maybe in resources or, systems to protect.
So my view of cybersecurity is not just defending against what's known, but creating an ecosystem, a cyber ecosystem that can morph and adjust to the threat of the day, the threat du jour. So what I mean by that is I look at an organization in a bow tie.
I love that, Ed. Threat du jour. We're gonna have to get a some sort of T-shirt made. I love that term. And maybe we can trademark that, Ed. That's great.
So I look at an organization in a bow tie fashion. So I look at all of the attack vectors and all of the ingress for attack. Where would attacks come from in the organization? And then in line to the event being the knot of the tie, in line to the event, what are the controls that would stop or alert on an attack coming from that vector? So if you've got all your vectors covered, now that's your cyber hygiene. That's what you need to maintain, is making sure that you have some sort of controls on all those attack vectors. But now you look at your intel and you say, who's attacking me today? Well, today it might be Greenpeace, and what they do is DDoS, or they do this. Well, that limits your attack vectors to what is the real and present danger? What's the risk du jour? And that's where you want to really focus your people on saying, look at these vectors more closely, because that's who's attacking us today. Tomorrow it might be anonymous. Oh, and they do this. That's these attack vectors. So you need to be able to shift your focus to the real and present danger. From the event itself, if the event should happen, then look at the mitigating or the compensating controls that will allow you to minimize the hurt, because that is, again, what's going to stop the actual consequence of the whole event happening. Consequence being loss of public confidence and all those other things, the consequences. If you maintain that as a program, you're able to see weakness or areas for improvement on either side of that event that you could shore up. And that's where you need to have your strategic objectives looking at. That's how you build your strategy plan, is plugging those holes in that whole event timeline. That's how I think that you build something that's resilient enough to look at the different attack scenarios that are most likely going to happen, and you're better spending your resource than trying to look at everything all the time. That's going to burn your people out. That's going to burn your budget out. It's going to burn your cycles out. Now, that's not to say you have to drop your attention on all those other attack vectors. I'm saying you need to focus on the real and present danger while maintaining your cyber hygiene. It's a trick, but you have to craft your personnel to be able to do that. You have to craft your teams to be able to do that. And so how you would justify that is by maintaining the program over time and getting your metrics and your roles defined so that you can utilize entry-level people, move them up through the organization, and really staff and create a path for everybody to be successful, not only the organization, but your employees as well.
And I think the key word that you just mentioned is how dynamic things are. Like the threats that are, exist today may not be here tomorrow. And I think that's the issue why it's so difficult to even automate a lot of these, threat analysis system, because the signal to noise ratio is very high, and things are so dynamic. And you can't, once you create a base, or you detect a baseline, that baseline changes. Right, very quickly.
Right.
How do you protect industrial systems specifically? You mentioned it's kind of the backbone of the economy, and there's an underlying weakness associated with all those systems because we rely heavily on industries that are essentially being traditionally, brick and mortar or low tech. Like you look at the kind of the pipeline companies, they're not necessarily so advanced in terms of their protection mechanism. And the people, you may have a quote unquote the person responsible for security who happen to be laying pipes for many years and then advance themselves into how it is. These industries. In your opinion, are we doing enough to protect the infrastructure from as you mentioned, kind of the next battlefield that's happening? Because we've seen a move from kinetic warfare to, combine that with cyber warfare as almost like as de facto of the next conflict.
Yeah. So we found out in Desert Shield, Desert Storm that a cyber attack coupled with a kinetic attack is very, very effective. And now our adversaries know that as well. The biggest thing that I think is hindering us is there's a lot of armchair quarterbacks out there that have also watched IT, and you realize that IT security practices mature. That is absolutely true, but you have to really recognize that OT, operational technology, is not IT, and it won't be for a very, very long time. The systems that are running our oil and gas and our chemical manufacturing and our manufacturing in general, a lot of those systems were designed 50 years ago, 20 to 50 years ago. They don't have the capacity to actually do the security that our IT resources can do. There's no memory. There's no hard drives in many cases. They don't even speak TCP/IP in some cases. So you have to look at the Purdue model and go down the layers and see what is an IT-like resource, and that is all the way down to your operational management network, all the way down to layer 2.5, 3 down to maybe 2.5 in the Purdue model. Those resources may be able to handle some things like zero trust. They may have authorization authentication. But when you get down to the control rooms, IAM is less useful in many cases because of the safety factor. So if you got a control room with a dozen people in it that have to see every screen all the time, they can't be walking up and logging on and logging off devices. They can't be walking up and logging on and logging off at the end of their shift even, because that creates a blind spot for the next operator. You've got to be able to see what's going on. So you have to think out of the box from IAM at that point to look at other technologies, proximity badges, biometrics, facial recognition, cameras, things like that. Then you have to compensate for what if the hideous disaster, people are on fire? How do they unlock the machine to stop the process and save lives and save other lives? I mean, it really is a much different environment than IT. So I think one of the challenges that I've noted throughout my career is you got to know what you have. You have to be able to see the assets. You have to know what's out there. When I walked into some of those chemical companies that I was talking about, I'd say, all right, where's the plant drawing? Where is everything? What am I working with here? And I'd get as-built drawings from 1950s with pen and pencil marks all over them that, well, we upgraded in 1980 to this, and we put that system over here. We retired that one, moved it over here. It was impossible to see what you had. That's becoming more and more prevalent as we start looking at how can we protect these assets. You've got to not only know what you have, but you got to know where it is. How does it play? What control loop does it play into? You got to be able to segment the network to say, all right, my critical process is here. These are my control loops that are in that critical process. Now elevate that risk higher because you don't want those to drop out. These other control loops, these acyclical processes, they are important, but not as important, so their risk is maybe lower. But you have to be able to make those decisions. And to do that, you've got to see the asset. And like I said, sometimes, especially in a very large DCS environment where you've got distributed control systems and multiple types of distributed control systems, that's where it becomes very difficult to understand what's there. I think that you also need a very, very, very verbose configuration management process. So your CMDB has to also understand your network and know what the config files are for all of your assets, because that's on the right side of that bow tie where the event happens. How do you get your mean time to recovery up? Well, you've got a starting point. That's a great one. If a piece drops out, you put a brand new piece of gear in there. Well, now you just drag and drop your config file. You got the last known good config. Boom, it's up and operational. You tweak it from there, and you're running again. That shortens your downtime, shortens your loss. So those, I think, are very important pieces that are starting to emerge in the OT network. But there's a lot of players making a lot of noise saying, oh, yeah, me too, we do OT. Yeah, we do OT. And they come to you with these IT-centric cloud-based things. And it's like, no, this is not IT, people. This is OT. This is different animal altogether. And once you make that recognition, the operators won't shun away from you. Because I got to tell you, all these cloud-based vendors that are like, oh, you get this cloud solution for this, and we validate that, and we block this, and okay, terrific. But my OT network is not going to be on the cloud. I mean, I just now got it connected through Industry 4.0 to the business systems. I'm certainly not going to pipe it all up to the cloud so you can go play with it. No, it's not going to happen. So the operators look at these people like they got six heads and go, there's the door over there. Get out.
I love this conversation because it seems like there's a lot of these buzzwords like OT, like in the industry and
right,
and a lot of Me Too's. And I think you're right. It's and as you mentioned, some of these folks have drawings with like coffee stains on it. That's how low tech they are. And to bring that to the cloud is too much of a gap. They're still, like you just mentioned, they're just connecting to some business systems, and definitely not going to pipe all the information out. So what do you suggest in the meantime to solve that gap? And by the way, when you saw those drawings, those like archaic drawings from 20, 30, 40 years ago, what was your reaction? How does one respond to something like that? Did you expect that? What was it like? Did you just say you just walk away? Like, how did you approach that?
You can't walk away. What you have to do, or what I had to do at the time, because there was very little technology to help us at the time. This is going back now 10 years or more. There was no real vendor assistance that was well known. Had I known then that PAS, sorry, I didn't mean to talk about brands, but had I known there were some systems out there that would help identify some of this, I would have used technology more. But at the time, we had manpower. At the time, we had to go out and actually research the plant floor, basically, and figure out what was connected to what. Look at the config files, backwards engineer that to say, okay, this one talks to that one, that one talks to this one.
So almost like a physical asset management. You have to physically go out and check. And that was a lot of work. That's a lot of legwork right there. Because asset management today in IT are fairly not, I wouldn't say simple, but there's a lot of systems out there that do a great job at asset management. There's a bunch of tools out there, but that's for IT. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing right now for OT specifically. So you have to actually do the legwork and show up and figure things out.
Well, we did years ago. We did, but now we mm-hmm. do have stuff like that. So, right. and there's two ways to approach it. Either the passive network sniffing approach, which looks on the wire and says what's floating across the wire. Let's gather all the information off the packet, and we'll build the asset inventory from that. Well, that really sees about 20% of the traffic. Sees about 20% of the OT network because, as I mentioned earlier, some of these devices don't even speak in TCP/IP. They don't even fly across the network. They're confined layers down in the DCSs, talking to different components down at that level, or maybe up one level, but they're not out on the network wire by any stretch of the imagination. So they can get missed. The other approach is to actually take the config files themselves from all of the devices that then feed into a logical mapping of the network. So by looking at the config file and saying, here's the applications, here's what they talk to, here's the pieces that they talk to, and then building from that a dynamic view of the network. That's one, more accurate because you know exactly what's talking to what. And two, it gives you that repository, that CMDB for the configuration management that comes from that. And that's, I think, the most efficient way of getting the real view. The only challenge between the two methods is one is real time on the network. The other one is a batch process that is maybe a day or a few hours behind real time. My argument to that is what's better, knowing exactly what's going on or not knowing or not seeing. So you've got real time for 20% of the assets, while the other 80% are not seen. I think it's better to have a large picture of everything that might be a day behind than to have only a portion of your network. And I think that's really, where I think some technologies are excelling.
And are there any standards that emerge?
That's all.
Are there any standards that emerged to provide that framework on how to approach some of these OT environments? And they have like best practices on how to advance the security?
Yeah, there's not yet, but I see it on the horizon, because if you look at the presidential directive that came out that for critical infrastructure that is really starting to talk about prescriptive measures like zero trust and the configuration management. So they're talking about it. TSA today is actually releasing updates to the oil and gas directives that specifically call out pieces that really fit into those categories of asset management and configuration management. So because of that, I can foresee standards coming. There are some Nist standards that have been published for critical infrastructure that are starting to become embraced. They're not that old. They don't have a lot of publicity around them, but they're out there. I forget the numbers, 83 something. I can look them up, but just search critical infrastructure standards from Nist, and you'll have a lot of good.
And there were some lessons learned from the pipeline, the ransomware incident that halted the because that was affecting, and it's funny because that's you can see the effect. I mean, we had shortage here on the East Coast.
Right.
Of gas and that really affected, and that was almost like the canary in the coal mine. The fact that there's something like that can happen and has a real effect, and it's becoming real. So I think that there's going to be definitely a movement towards fixing some of these areas as well.
Right. Well, I think that's again, going back. Go ahead, David.
No, just go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that in itself, using Colonial Pipeline as an example, is one of the reasons why I'm such a firm believer in using that bow tie method, because I don't believe that they were prepared to say that a ransomware attack was actually going to affect OT in the way it did. But because of that crossover, there is no such thing as air gap anymore. I don't care who's going to tell you there's air gap between IT and OT. It's not there. Industry 4.0 and connecting everything together has made it so that the business relies on the metrics from the operational technology. So there's going to be crossovers. There's going to be entry points or vectors for attack that you have to be cognizant of. So the fact that their billing system couldn't tell them now how much fuel was going up to the East Coast and they couldn't actually bill for it, that was a business decision that said we're going to be losing billions per day versus this stupid ransom. Well, there's a business decision for you. So shutting down the pipeline to stop the bleeding, paying the ransom and hoping to get recovered was the second part of their strategy. I mean, these were decisions made at the time that I believe had they known the attack vector, they could have put controls to say, all right, what's going to be my backup to this? How am I going to do this a different way? Can I use field sensors to monitor the flow of that fuel? Can I do something different than the status quo? Those are the things I think should be thought through. And by looking at those attack vectors and the flow of that attack, how it goes from the vectors through to consequence, very important so that you look at every step of the way and get your contingency plans in play.
So Ed, no air gaps, and I would say no security by obscurity either.
No.
The fact that they
yeah. That's one of the big mistakes that people think, oh, I'm not going to be a target. Yeah, you are.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that, the small to mid-sized businesses in the U.S. are the kind of the backbone of the economy. And there's a lot of, quote unquote, critical components that they manufacture. And we see that now with supply chain disruption. So if a company that makes widgets, but, and they're quote unquote fairly low tech and they think they're not going to get hacked for whatever reason, and they do, and they're now shut down, and then it creates a trickle effect to the rest of the whatever impact of the industry. So that everyone is critical. There's no, there's no non-critical, components out there. So fast forward to today, what it is that you do today, and then maybe like kind of the last question, we're going to wrap it up, as how is it best to reach out to you for, consultation, just insight, whatever else maybe.
Sure. Well, thanks. I joined Hexagon ALI, which is Asset Lifecycle Intelligence Group. I don't know, about 6 months ago, or 2 or 3 months ago, I should say. I haven't been on board very long, but my role for Hexagon is to look for vendor and partnerships that make sense to grow our cyber ecosystem so that we can play best to protect assets. The things that I've been discussing, that's really what we focus on, is the asset lifecycle and the intelligence behind that asset lifecycle. So looking for configuration management augmentation in the OT environment, looking for asset management, looking for vulnerability, looking to establish risk of those assets. That's all what we do. Now, I'm working on partnerships with other companies that augment that help us drive forward as a unified step. There's other players in the market. I'm not looking to compete with them. I'm looking to augment them because they do what they do and they have their benefits. I do what I do. I do it different than anybody else. The way we approach asset lifecycle is much different than our competitors. So we can actually enhance what they provide and vice versa. They can enhance what we provide. So I'm looking to make partnerships with companies that really want to make a difference and help this, what I consider a very critical component. Similar to when I was in the Navy and I thought, people will die if this stuff gets out. It's the same with this. We will suffer if our critical infrastructure goes down. I want to make a difference here, the same as I did on the battlefield. Best way to get a hold of me, LinkedIn. It's real simple. LinkedIn.com/in/Liebig, my last name, Liebig. Or send me an email, edward.liebig@hexagon, like a hexagon.com.
Awesome. And thank you very much. We should probably do this again, and hopefully, I'm probably going to meet you sometimes in New York, and I would love to meet you in person. You probably have more stories that you can share, maybe in front of a live audience. But between now and then, thank you very much again for spending the time. Great stories and great journey. I love it. Absolutely love it. And you're right. You are making a difference. It's, critical infrastructure is a matter of national security. And we'd like for it to stay up in a given moment, because we're all going to get impacted. So thank you very much for sharing the time with us.
Thank you, David.
So until then, stay safe. Until then, stay safe. Okay. Outside of the digital world, and as well as inside. So thank you very much.